Thank you. Great. And I just got the notification that we're being recorded for other folks who would like to watch this later. So welcome and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on what time you are coming in from. Really excited to talk to folks today. So I'm planning to present some slides for about 15 or 20 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have the opportunity to chat and hear some questions and hear about your experiences as well. Um, I would like to start this out with the caveat that my specific area of expertise is in multilingual, multicultural education and immigrant populations. And so when all of this started happening in the context of COVID, I'm sure like a lot of you have seen terms like this used about the pandemic. Unprecedented. This has never happened before. We don't know how to deal with these struggles. This is all very different. This is all very new. And that's partially true when we're talking about the scale of interruptions that have happened during this pandemic, the global nature of schooling being interrupted, and not to mention just, of course, the emotional toll and the human toll of lives this has taken. So not to take away from any of that, but when we're talking specifically about education and kids being out of school and their schooling being interrupted, I would say from my vantage point in the field of immigrants and multilingual, multicultural education, that's not exactly true. So we do have quite a wealth of research on populations who have experienced interrupted schooling in slightly different contexts. And though I have a very short time with you today, I've put the citation below for an article that has come out that I'm glad to send this to people if you don't have access to this particular journal, where I talk about some of these ideas and overlaps in more length. A term that I want to, some of you might know this, I might be introducing it to some of you today, but I'm going to be using the term SIFE, which we use as an acronym for Students with Interrupted Formal Education. Sometimes you'll see this as SLIFE with an L for students with limited interrupted formal education. And when people in my field are using this term, it is almost always used to talk about immigrant or refugee populations whose schooling has either been interrupted in their home countries due to conditions there. Perhaps there was a pandemic there. Perhaps there's political instability or poverty. So they don't have the sequence of schooling we might expect of students. Or it gets interrupted when they are moving to a new country. Maybe they've gone around through some resettlements and they've, of course, been out of school during this time. So it's usually used to talk about that. And so the field of SIFE education is about talking about what challenges exist for this group of students, also what opportunities exist, because they usually have a wealth of experiences, just might not be in a formal classroom setting. Often in this field, we focus on language because the students might be coming and they might speak a different language. And you might be thinking that to yourselves as well. For today's presentation, I'm actually going to focus less on the linguistic aspect because we're talking about COVID, interrupted schooling for everybody. But I will say the brief caveat is that a SIFE student with interrupted formal education would actually have different outcomes than language learners who have not had interrupted education. And usually those would be lower. So there is something about the interruption of schooling beyond just language difference that's affecting students there. But then, of course, today we can think about other interruptions that happen even when there's not a pandemic. So a student might be out of school for a long period of time because of their own health issues. Sometimes we have students with terminal cancer that are out for a long time, students who get suspended, even unfortunately students who are incarcerated. So there are a host of other reasons that students could miss a lot of school. We don't always use this term SIFE for all of those groups, but I'm thinking about all of those groups today. And so I have two goals in doing this work. First, I want to inform us as we're thinking about education during and hopefully post-COVID what can we learn from previous research on students with interrupted schooling coming into school? This is not unprecedented. This is not brand new. But second, I really want us to think about what are some accommodations we might have put in place during this pandemic that would be helpful for future generations of SIFE students. Even hopefully when we are past this pandemic, there will still be interrupted schooling for migrant students, for students who get sick, for students experiencing housing insecurity. So what can we put in place that we've learned from this pandemic for those students in the future? So I'll separate this into two parts today. And the first part, and I'll go through these points fairly quickly, is first of all, what can we learn from previous SIFE research? And the 4 points I'll go over briefly with that are very important to have that research shows us is, first, we need a responsive curriculum. We might have to change the curriculum to respond to student needs. Second, thinking about different policy or program accommodations that students might need. And then the last two I'll kind of put together for time's sake, but thinking about social and emotional supports, and then also collaboration and community engagement. So I'll touch on each of these points briefly right now. First, when we think about students coming back to school after experiencing interrupted education, the first thing it comes up into our minds, particularly those of us who are teachers, is what about the curriculum? What will I teach? Will my students be behind? What will I do with that? And fully acknowledging that that's difficult, what we've learned from SIFE education is it's very unproductive at any time to spend more time thinking about where you wish your students were. You say, okay, they're in the 5th grade, but they're behind. They're at a different level. I feel like they're behind. I wish they knew this. Yes, we can talk about that in the break room. We can talk about that over drinks. That's frustrating, but it's very unproductive to wish your students are in a place where they are not. So it's sort of about resetting expectations, and wherever your students arrive, whatever experiences they have had with education, that's exactly where they are supposed to be and exactly where we as teachers meet them. And a lot of folks, that throws them off a little bit, and particularly in the United States, where we have a lot of standardization in our education, and we create these standards and benchmarks for where students should be at a certain grade level. It's important for us to remember that we created those as a field, as guidelines for students and teachers to kind of say, well, what should you be teaching a 14-year-old student versus an 11-year-old student? Those aren't etched in stone. So thinking that and remembering that those standards or benchmarks are made to serve students, but not vice versa. We're not expecting the students, we shouldn't expect the students to be fully beholden to those as if they were set in stone. And some teachers might be less familiar with this, but honestly, schools have a wealth of experience with teachers who would listen to this talk and say, I do this every year. My students come to me at different levels. So for folks for whom this might be a little bit intimidating to think, how can I differentiate my curriculum for students at different levels? Talk to your colleagues and teachers in special education for students with special needs. They do this every year, adapting curriculum. Bilingual language, immigrant education, those folks do this every year. Even general education teachers, there's a wealth of knowledge that teachers will say, I know how to help differentiate a curriculum for different classrooms. Not to say it's easy, but to say that we have that experience base and professionalism in a lot of our schools. And then ultimately, I think this is actually a very hopeful way to get us to what we always often say we want to do in education, which is to say, oh, we want to have student-centered learning. We want the students' needs to lead. We want the students themselves to lead. We pay lip service to that in education, but then we often just kind of fall back on, but you're in 9th grade, so you should learn this, this, and this. I think actually the pandemic might give us the opportunity to really look at student-centered ways of approaching teaching as well, kind of forcing us into what we have wanted to do all along. Second, for previous SIFE research is thinking that there might be more substantial program or policy accommodations that will be required beyond the individual classroom. And for this, with students who have missed years of schooling, months of schooling even, thinking of different ways to restructure their expectations, graduation requirements, and credit recovery ways to do that. I don't necessarily like this term, but it comes up as a research in this idea of how students can recover credits they might have missed. So specific classes they need to have taken in order to graduate in a particular state or country often has requirements for this. And some ways that SIFE advocates have tried to work with this is alternative grading. So instead of, a grade point or an A through F grading, sometimes you can accommodate students for a short period of time of giving them pass-fail grading for classes. They either pass the class or they don't, rather than a specific grade level. That's a way to get them that credit. But often, and this one I think is really interesting, interdisciplinary coursework. So let's say you've missed math credits and science credits, or you've missed literature credits and history credits. Thinking about creative ways where you could get both of those credits through one course. We think of a humanities seminar that has literature and history in it, or a STEM seminar where we're looking at math and engineering and chemistry. And actually, we do this in the field of gifted education as sort of a higher level curriculum. So this is not a watering down of the curriculum, but if we think of creative ways to combine these so students can essentially be taking multiple classes at the same time, that's a form of enrichment, not watering down. For the first part, this is the last point in the first part, and I'm going to combine these for time's sake. We really need to be thinking about students' socio-emotional in addition to their academic needs, and thinking about ways that this can help us collaborate with communities as well. The first most important thing with SIFE education is we need to disrupt the idea that there's this dichotomy between students' academic needs and their emotional needs. For students with interrupted formal education, if they're coming from a traumatic experience or a difficult experience, we know from research on cognitive science that will impede them from learning what we want to learn, or what we want them to learn until those emotional needs are addressed. So when thinking about students coming back from a pandemic, of course, they may have actually had family members affected or that will have passed away, but even being away from their friends for a very long time, just these disruptions. If we bring them back to school and say, all right, we're going to immediately open your books to page 5, we're not going to process any of what happened. The research shows that might be less effective than if we really process the emotional parts of this together as well. And then with that, there's a lot of research on education in times of crisis that humans in times of crisis often feel need to connect at that point. If you think of after an earthquake or a natural disaster, that people often come out and want to help each other and serve each other. We haven't been able to do that as much with this pandemic because we've been separated. But as we get the time to come together, this is a really good way, again, to do what we say we've always wanted to do and involve community members in schools, base our curriculum on student community, guest speakers, and local organizations that could help out with some of these emotional needs as well. What's important to know about all 4 of these things is these are accommodations that have been advocated for decades from those of us who work with SIFE students or students with interrupted formal education. And we've got really interesting things happening because these little accommodations we've been asking for are now being piloted en masse in entire countries or entire systems. Which brings me to my second main point about thinking, what can we preserve from this pandemic time for future SIFE students? And I'll go through 3 ideas here. First, just confronting the idea that particular accommodations are impossible. We've now disproven that because they have been proven possible for a broad range of students. Then really rethinking informal and formal learning binaries, in-school learning versus out-of-school learning. And then finally, and this is work we all really need to do during this pandemic, is disrupting the pervasive narrative of loss, learning loss as the only thing we're focusing on during the pandemic. For this first one, for those of you who might have worked with SIFE students before, you might have kind of gotten frustrated or laughed to yourself seeing this past year and a half accommodations that we have begged for our students that we've been told are impossible suddenly happen when a pandemic has affected more students. So when we think of this idea of what can we achieve when there's collective will, for me in the US context, things people said would never happen. Last year, there was suspension or de-emphasis of standardized testing. We often have federal regulations, state regulations that say students need to take these tests at certain times. Guess what? They said that doesn't apply this year. Now that is coming back with a vengeance, I dare say, this year, that now we're testing, but we've proven that it is possible to actually suspend or de-emphasize those tests for a period of time for students. In a lot of countries that were able and systems that were able, we offered free distance learning to students through platforms, just like we're doing at this conference right now, but teachers got online, systems went online. And in a lot of places, they provided students either the materials, the technology, and even piloted ways to get Wi-Fi to students who didn't have it. And again, we know there's a technology gap even when there's not a pandemic, but we've really proven that when there's collective will, a lot of systems have been able to go out and get their students online. So these are just a few examples of when people say something's impossible or impractical, is it, or is it just different than the way we've done things before? What I always tell folks when they say like, oh, is it possible for us to make that accommodation? Is that practical? I say you have to ask yourself, if the students in your classroom aren't learning the things they're supposed to learn with what you're currently doing, is that practical? If only half the students are grasping the material, is that practical? So we got to start to think about confronting this idea, which COVID has showed us different ways to do. And then second, this idea of rethinking what is school learning and home learning, and are those separate things? And I would say the field of SIFE is guilty of this. We say students with interrupted formal education as if formal education is the only important place that learning happens. But we know from research on adult learning, those of you who are out of schooling right now, you're still learning, you're still finding things out, you're still studying. And we know that students have spent a lot of time at home or outside or out in their communities in different ways during this pandemic. And how can we capture that as learning as well? If we think about, I think students today have learned more about health and community care than I ever did in my schooling. And how can we capture that as legitimate learning? Because it is. And so there are some folks that are saying this pandemic is an opportunity for us to return to nature, to play-based learning, to really thinking about community care as part of our curriculum. And I think we can capitalize on that. And then finally, I think it's very appropriate that there's probably some anxiety, as there always is with students with interrupted formal education, is that they've lost their learning. They had it and they lost it somewhere. We talk a lot about learning loss that's happening now. And I don't want to dismiss that entirely, but also I will say it's fully expected. If a student isn't at school for a period of time, the things that are the tests scores will go down. This is utterly unsurprising. We don't necessarily need research to tell us that that's what would happen. But I think we can also think about ways that might be us needing to critique the measures we're using. A lot of the assessments we use were normed on and presume students have had an uninterrupted schooling trajectory from kindergarten through 12th grade. It's predicated on that idea. So if you have an assessment that is not normed on or tested on students who might have different learning trajectories than that, we need to rethink what that assessment is showing. So if all of the measurements we're using right now are only showing that students have lost learning or not learned anything in the last 18 months, we're using the wrong assessment. How could we change our assessment to capture what students have learned in that time and then use that in the classroom? But perhaps most importantly, and one of the lessons I really want to drive home about interrupted formal education is if we as teachers, if all we see is loss, if we treat our students like they're broken or behind, the students will believe us and we will lose them at that point. This happens over and over again with a student with interrupted formal education, constantly told he or she is behind, they need to be somewhere else. The graduation rates for these students are abysmal, not because we don't teach them, because they drop out. They're sick of hearing that. They internalize that message. So those of us who are teachers can really think of ways that we can counteract that message that students are really feeling and already hearing in news media and society. So when we think of all these ways that we can preserve this for students in the future, I think this way of rethinking students with interrupted formal education can really help us rethink formal education in a lot of creative ways now as well. With that, I'm really interested if folks have questions, and if we don't have, or experiences that you have had that this resonates with. And if we don't have time to get to all the questions today, here's my contact information as well. And like I said, I'm also glad to send folks this article if you're not able to access this journal as well. But thank you very much for your time today.